So welcome to this second panel, which is called Infowars, Disinformation and Democracy in the Digital Ecosystem. And as compared to the first panel, we are switching from the micro level, which was presented, and the global or theoretical level, to some kind of intermediate range, intermediate level. We could also call the panel Bringing the State Back In. And the state we are talking of when we think of democracy and of disinformation and infowars in recent 5 years is, as we all know, is Russia. And we have some very interesting guest presenters who did research into the question, is Russia trying to influence democracy, election campaigns in Central and Eastern Europe, in Western Europe? How is it doing this, and how influential is it? Is it really successful in doing this? And last but not least, is this the right focus to put the question as I did it, or should we more or less ask, why are Western societies open to some kind of external influence which is changing the political discourse in our societies? So, bringing the state back in, we will start with our discussants, and we have Anton Shekhovtsov, who is a visiting fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences, and in his work, his research as an editor and as a researcher, he focuses on the European far right. He's originally from Ukraine and started with research on far right groups in Ukraine, but he extended this research to the whole of Europe, especially Western Europe. Then we have Milena Iakimova. You have Dimitar on your program, but she is a colleague of him, and they did the research together. Milena is an associate professor at the Department of Sociology of the Sofia University, and she is a member of the editorial board of Critique and Humanism, a Eurozine network partnership journal from Bulgaria. Welcome. And last but not least, Joanna Rohozinska, who is a senior program officer with the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, and she has worked and lived in Central and Eastern Europe for many years and has much experience on this issue, and she will comment on the two presentations by Anton and Milena. So we will start with you, Anton. Maximum 10 minutes, maximum.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for the introduction. As was correctly mentioned in the introduction, I mostly focus on the far right. So talking about disinformation, I will be talking about two entities. That would be the far right, or Western far right. And by the West, I mean the entire European Union plus the US plus Canada. And on the other hand, I will be talking about Russia. But I think it's quite crucial to remind ourselves that Russia was not engaged in the information warfare or disinformation campaigns in the 90s. I mean, at least not on the West. The influence of Russia was mostly felt in the post-Soviet space, but there was no interference, in my opinion, in the workings of the democratic institutions and societies in Western countries in the 90s, and probably even during the first period, the first presidential term of Vladimir Putin. But the period that we are talking about, when disinfo became such a important topic of discussions, I would go back to 2008. To August 2008, more precisely, because that was the time when Russia successfully provoked Georgia into a war, which ended very quickly. Russia won, occupied 2 regions of Georgia, and so the war lasted only for 8 days. And why I'm saying that was important in the framework of our discussion about disinformation is that the expert community, the media in the Russian Federation, they all felt that they managed to convince the Russian society in that Russia's actions were justified, the occupation and also the war against Georgia, but they utterly failed to convince the international community, and they felt that they lost the information war with the West. And that was important, because if you look at how the media, the Russian media commented on this allegedly failed information war, they were desperate. They were desperate because they couldn't really find any commentators in the West who would justify Russia's actions. And they were so desperate that one quite established newspaper even went as far as to quote anonymous bloggers in one of the comment sections of Spanish newspaper, an online newspaper. So you would have these commentators, anonymous commentators, and they would just quote. There was a whole page of quotations from those comments. But eventually they found allies, people who would be very positive about Russia's actions in Georgia. And those were far-right activists. Many of them were marginal, like, for example, Lyndon LaRouche, the American sort of right-wing, anti-Semitic activist. He was on Russia Today, and he was completely in agreement with the Kremlin's actions. They also found that the leader of the Austrian Freedom Party, the far-right party in Austria, was also talking positively about the Kremlin's actions and very negatively about the contemporary president of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili, and it was immediately taken up by the Russian media, and it was everywhere almost. And at that time, it was very important for the Russian media to convince the Russian society that Russia does have some allies in the West, because they really felt that Russia was becoming isolated because the international community did not believe in the righteousness of Russia's actions. And that is how it started. 2008 and 2009. In 2009, Russia Today was renamed into RT. Also, the agenda has changed of this TV channel, because this TV station, TV channel that was established in 2005 as a sort of a soft power tool of the Russian Federation that would be talking about how Russia is great. In 2009 changed, and the focus shifted to the West. So the agenda would be to convince Western audiences that not that Russia is so good, but that the Western society, Western governments are really bad. So that was the most important change. And again, they found allies, people who would comment on that, people who would be elaborating this new message of the Russian media, not only RT, but also the Voice of Russia, the radio station that operated in several European languages, and it was replaced in 2015 by Sputnik News. So they found these commentators, and on the far right, on the far left, in the isolationist circles, in the conspiracy theory circles. So those were people who would essentially say, yes, Western governments are conspiring against our societies, and they are not telling the truth. And the Russian media was presented and was considered as a sort of this alternative voice. There were very interesting structural relations that developed since then. For example, in 2012, one far-right circle in France, loosely related to the Front National, to the National Front, had an agreement with the Voice of Russia, with this radio station, and they ran a TV channel, internet-based TV channel called, very originally, Pro-Russia TV, and that was a real structural relation. They got money for that from the Russian media. It was around 300,000 euros for 2 years of operation. It's a small amount of money, but still, they had that relation. Then the Italian far-right activists from the Northern League, or the Lega Nord, they also established structural relations with the Voice of Russia and later Sputnik in 2014, and they had a website which was operating in partnership with the far right. There are also quite interesting developments in the internet space in terms of hosting and registering in the Russian domain zone in .ru or .ru. You may remember in August this year there was this neo-Nazi march in Charlottesville in the US, and one counter-protester was killed, and the editor of the American neo-Nazi website, the Daily Stormer, he said that, well, he essentially laughed at the death of that person. And the website was closed down by Google, and it was also closed down by their hosters, and it moved to the Russian domain zone, although it was closed within a day, because that was a really, anti-Semitic, right-wing extremist website. It also gives us an insight how some far-right websites in the West, they find home in the Russian internet. Either they're hosted on the Russian servers, or they just register with the Russian domain zone. Because especially in Germany, where the laws about extremism are quite harsh, and it's quite easy to close down right-wing extremist websites in Germany. So some of them they do move to Russia, and in many cases it's almost impossible to close them down. So, just to sum up, when we are talking about Russian disinformation and the far right, so I would probably highlight three areas. First, it's the Russian media that engage with far right activists to promote its anti-Western agenda, and in many cases conspiracy theory agenda, aimed at undermining the trust towards democratic institutions and Western governments. Then we are also talking, because there is also an agency on the far right side. So the second area would be resources run by far right activists, Western far right activists, with the help of the Russian actors. And the third large area, that would be far right using the Russian resources and having sort of a protection from the Russian side, so they could run these resources. Otherwise, they would have been closed down by Western institutions, Western agencies.
Thank you, Anton. My first question would be, if you're talking of Russia or Russian actors, do you have any insights? Who exactly is Russia? Whom do you mean when you are talking of Russian actors? Is it really state-run? So it's kind of the Russian state, the FSB, so the secret services are trying to influence the Western discourse? Or are there also some kind of transnational relations between ideologically linked groups in Russia and in Central and Eastern and Western Europe?
Well, first of all, it's the Russian media, the Russian state-controlled media. So Russia today was from the beginning controlled by the state. Then we have the Voice of Russia, which is also controlled by the state. So here we're talking about the state actors. It's not the FSB, it's not any security or intelligence services. These are media channels. So that would be the state itself, or at least part of the state, which is controlling the media. But then you also have, I will give you an example. There is another internet-based TV station, Russian TV station called Tsargrad TV, and it's run not by the state, it's not controlled by the state. It's run by the Russian ultra-nationalist Orthodox oligarch Konstantin Malofeev. And he's the person who is trying to produce a product, the media product, that he would later sell to the Kremlin in exchange for some resources, financial resources and material resources or whatever. But he's this patriotic freelancer in quotation marks. So that he's not part of the state, but he wants something from the state, and then he wants to create a product that he would sell to the state. So yes, there are and he's ideologically very close to far-right activists. He has been contributing to establishing relations between far-right activists in the West, and also people who would be close to the Kremlin. So that would be from the Russian side. So, but he's an ideological operator of these relations. But I would not in this area. Of the relations between the Russian media and the far-right activists, I wouldn't say that there is much on the sort of FSB or intelligence side. But my colleagues from Hungary tell me that there is one website which is hosted in Russia and has and also it's registered on the Russian domain zone, but it's run in Hungarian by Hungarian right-wing extremists, and they tell me that it's certainly a sort of Russian intelligence operation. But these cases are very few, very few.
Okay, this was the question for the side of the actor, so Russia, and the second question is the recipient. How influential is Russia? Are these Russian actors? How important for changing the discourse, becoming relevant political players, or not being cracked down by the state? Are these Russian activities for the European far right?
You know, it's very difficult to evaluate the actual impact. And to my knowledge, there has been no deep research on whether Russian propaganda, either through the far-right websites or any other resources, what's the actual effect of this. But at the same time, I'll give you an example from 2014 when one Austrian publication, far-right publication, Direct Info, they published a piece in which they said that they had an anonymous source in the Austrian army, and that source said that the Americans it was 2015, that the Americans were trying, that the Americans had been helping Syrian refugees to go to Europe, and so, you know, to facilitate this route from Syria to Europe, to the European Union, and that was done by the Americans. And that particular story, this fake news story, even made it to some mainstream publications in terms of creating, you know, this paranoid narrative in this discussion of this very complex topic about the refugee crisis. Or, for example, so it made it to the mainstream, although it was just a implanted story in a marginal publication. Another story is about, again, Hungary, where one far-right website connected directly to the Russian propaganda machine published a story about Hungarian tanks that were transported to Ukraine. And that was a huge scandal, and even the Ministry of Defense in Hungary had to comment. But in the conspiracy theory website, on the conspiracy theory websites, you would still have this widespread rumor that Hungary was providing tanks for Ukraine.
So the most important question is, why do fake news make it to the mainstream media? And I think that's exactly what Milena, together with Dimitar, have done in a case study research for Bulgaria, shifting the focus from who is trying to influence to why could a foreign actor presumably influence the national discourse, and who is interested in this else.
Okay. I will start with a small correction. I am not going to talk about fake news. I don't think this is the problem at all. I will say a few words at the beginning. Most of the time I teach, and when I'm lucky, I do research. So I'm going to talk about research that has a lot to do with what Anton said. Those talking points elaborated by an official machine, by state-controlled media, circulate, and they circulate, I would say, if not globally, maybe even globally. So this is a strange beginning, probably, but this is a beginning that is aimed to insist that Bulgaria is, as awkward as it might be, is not just a local case. It's rather a lab of how democratic tools are used toward non-democratic ends. And I think this has something to do with the previous panel here. But first, let me tell you a few words about the research we did, not only Dimitar and me. Our journal is published by a group of academic people who are trying to be a research institution as well, not only a publisher of cultural journalism. A few years ago, we noted that there is a significant growth in anti-liberal talking in Bulgarian language. And Bulgarian language is rather small, which makes it easy for research, for structural, linguistic, semantic, content research and analysis. So we decided to do this research, and we managed it. To see what are the basic messages of this anti-liberal talking. Of course, they are not that surprising. And Anton mentioned some of them. They follow conspirational logics, and they said Europe is declining, Europe is dying, because it is captured by the European Union. This creates the opposition between civilization and political organization. Political organization is mortal to our European civilization. How come? This is the long arm of America that is doing it. America is letting all this Islamic avalanche toward Europe, just the same conspirational talking point. And Europe is weak because of another, not that direct American weapon, and these are human rights. Human rights are American invention that is destroying European resilience toward the Islamic avalanche. We can see it, by the way, in the European dystopic literature, Welbeck not to mention here. And what is left from Europe, one starts asking oneself in the long run. What is left? The political union is anti-European, and human rights are an American weaponry. So what is left from Europe? Nation states is the simple answer. So I gave you a brief reconstruction of a huge research, huge and pedantic and very, very boring research with many, many numbers and counting. We counted a lot of keywords in 3,080 newspapers and websites. Why? Because they are crucial for the production of interpretations. In the previous panel, the topic of democracy and of participatory democracy was touched. But the crucial point with the participatory democracy is who coins the issues. And this is the power of interpretation. And this power belongs not to Facebook. Facebook does not produce contents. It belongs not to Twitter, it belongs not to the televisions even. It belongs to the slow writing, if not slow reading. This is the main reason that we did exactly this research work. So in the long run, is it Russian propaganda? If it was only Russian propaganda, we wouldn't be that surprised to hear the same talking, or nearly the same talking points by the newly elected American president. Protests against me are paid, mainstream media are foreign agents and are also paid, and so on. Is it the long arm of Moscow here? I doubt. We all doubt, and I think we can prove it. But the most important thing here is that it is not a matter of fake news, and that it is not a matter of disinformation. We call it very, very deliberately propaganda. Why propaganda? I think this is the more critical word. The word disinformation is sort of weak. It has not enough critical sharpness and strength. It is propaganda because it aims to be effective. It is speech that aims to be effective. It is speech that is relying not on argument, but on impression management. It is speech that wraps up, that packs the already pre-existent but diffuse stereotypes and resentments of the public. Let me get back, probably, no, I don't have time to get back to data. But this propaganda is used when we counted those publications in three, I won't get very technical. If you are interested, I can give all the technical details later on in the discussion. What we discovered when making the profiles of the media studied is that there are at least two among them, at least two in our sample, mainstream media that are direct Russian propaganda. Right, this cannot be denounced. There is Russian propaganda in Bulgaria. But this is not the point. This is not the point. The point is that this propaganda, these talking points are parasitic. What they do is to wrap up figures of the imminent European critique of rationality and of democracy that belong to the Enlightenment tradition. These figures, these imminent critical figures of critique of rationality, are wrapped up in simple, repetitive figures that are later on, using this social media market, circulated globally and delivered as ready-made figures for local use. And this is why I started with the fact that Bulgaria is not just awkward, it's a lab. Printed media and websites are in miserable condition right now. So they get to this ready-made, easily circulated, simple figures that rely on local European feelings of injustice, on social feelings. And this is what makes them really effective, that they resonate with some social feelings of injustice. Well, I'm getting to my conclusion here. When we are talking about that, it's, of course, close to mind to expect the critique, is it anti-democratic propaganda? Isn't it anti-liberal propaganda, but still democratic one? So let's go to the image of the demos. What is the demos of this anti-liberal propaganda? What does it want? I quote, nothing. The small man, another quotation, the small man is not good for big things. End of quote. The demo still is wise. What is making it wise? It clearly sees that all the integration policies are actually not answering to certain human rights needs, but are giving privileges. And this is the long arm of America here. Giving privileges to certain minority groups, which is demolishing nation-state resilience. So Demos's wisdom is hate speech. Hate speech is promoted to the status of civil virtue. And one can see this in the awkward case of Bulgarian Trud newspaper or Aspecto magazine, but also in Le Figaro, for example. And a lot of UK tabloid printed media, Judy will confirm, I guess. Who is using this? This is a crucial point. Of course, some Moscow-paid local agents in this miserable environment, of course, but also homegrown groups of interest that are easily to be defined. Homegrown local agents that are using Kremlin-made, ready-made wrap-ups of imminent European Enlightenment self-critiques. Thanks.
Thank you. It's very interesting, but could you shortly continue to elaborate on these homegrown groups? Because Anton was talking of far-right, small, more or less small groups, but as I understood from your paper you have written for this conference, you're not talking about small groups on the far right, but on big oligarchs in the center of the political system.
Right. Liberal democracies produce oligarchies. And there are oligarchic circles in Bulgaria, this is for sure. I'm just a researcher, not a special agent, so I wouldn't bet my head, even my salary, on delineating them. But at least two of them, these are circles that are interested in leaking from the state, in making profits from the state, not by means of state regulation, but directly from the state. With my English, I don't have words for these things, as when you make an auction for building a highway, for example. You all know it. I don't need. If you all know it, yeah, I'll ask you later to improve my vocabulary. These are at least two such circles that are interested. What's the point here? It's a judicial system. What's crucial for vital democracy? It's in my country, the idea of participatory democracy was used to anti-democratic ends. What the society was prepared for anti-NATO referendum, for example. What was cultivated, reinforced, was that direct democracy is Nein sagen. just say no, whistle on, this is direct democracy. The crucial, in my mind, it is not direct democracy, that's the healing for the sick democracy. The vital remedy are media and judicial system. And in this fast world of rapid liberalization, judicial system is really crucial. And judicial system in Bulgaria is crucially dependent on prosecutor's office. So it's a matter of prosecution. It's not a matter of disinformation. It's a matter of society getting back its society, getting back its control over the prosecution. What means prosecution is the crucial point. Bulgarian prosecution is totally autonomous to decide whether to start actions, I mean investigatory, not prosecuting, just to make an investigation or not. Write whatever you want in whatever news media. It's up to the prosecution. It is not obliged even to report reasons. So these are very, very simple questions that are, the key is in prosecution, not that our prosecutor is bad, but the way it is constitutionally structured.
Okay, as far as I see, we have three different views on the same question. In the first panel, it was new technologies change the game of democracy, with a skeptical and an optimistic view. What Anton presented was foreign actors use the new technologies to change the game of democracy. And you were shifting the focus towards ideas. It's basically the same thing as during the Cold War. The question is, why are we open to these cliches, to propaganda, to ready-made ways of thinking, perhaps even to worldviews? This is because you use the word anti-liberal, so it's about a liberal world, liberal ideas, and to put it in another way, conservative, right-wing, anti-liberal or Russian world views. So you're completely shifting the focus. Joanna, I would not say that one of these views is right, but one of it could be more important. Perhaps you could just tell us from your experience, your work in Central and Eastern Europe in the last decade, and perhaps even from Poland, which of these three views, technology changes the game, foreign actors, or it's homegrown, homemade, is the most important?
But I think it's the perfect storm is the problem. Yeah? And I think that's what makes this so complicated. And if you kind of want to go back to the title of it, much attention has been paid to disinformation, Infowars, and trying to make it simplify it, I think, a little bit too much, and I think that gives it a disservice. So if all of these things being true, the thing that I always look at is, so why is it working, right? So what's the vulnerability, and how do you react against that? And I think setting up a Cold War narrative that you have to have counter-propaganda against Russia is a road to nowhere, quite frankly, or it ends up being a little bit of missing the point as well. You know, a Hungarian colleague of mine, specifically about Russian propaganda and Russian disinformation intervention in Hungary, said, well, the problem is that they're not creating the wounds, they're just pouring salt on it. And so the idea about figuring out where the vulnerabilities are, and that does tend to be quite specifically domestic, is much more difficult and much more time-consuming and much more challenging both for domestic actors and for international actors. And in terms of the liberal, anti-liberal, right-left ideological spectrum, I think that you kind of have to remove that as well, because the tendency is actually anti-systemic from my point of view. It can appear on the far right, it can appear on the far left, but what it amounts to ultimately is that there's a lack of faith and interest in the political structures and a feeling of disenfranchisement from the political process as a whole. If you don't go vote, or if you don't find that you have a party that represents you, that leaves a huge gap and lots of room to maneuver for small parties that may be a minority but can still mobilize voters to carry a larger majority. And so it ends up being a larger structural problem that is not limited to Europe, frankly. If you want the case of Poland, I mean, it is an interesting thing because in terms of Russian propaganda, not exactly. I think a lot could be said about Poles, but it would take an awful lot to make them pro-Russian in any way. There's a lot of background there. But what you can do is you can raise a very painful issue of the relations that we have with our immediate neighbors, specifically with the Ukrainians and the Lithuanians. And so finding a plethora of information it's a complicated history, and so there's also not a lot of black and white, but I mean, it's a lot of issues that were never really discussed and solved in the past, and now they're all of a sudden bubbling up. What the net effect has been kind of a neutralization of Poland's foreign policy, which has been pro-Ukrainian since 1991. And also creating a much more complicated situation in the country as you have a lot of Ukrainians coming in. I mean, what it does is it destabilizes something that's been relatively positive and progressive, and creates an awful lot of space for bitterness, hate speech, and all the rest of it that ends up poisoning the rest of the system. Where the rise of law and justice came from is also not simple. They did not appear overnight, and it's not because I don't think that Poles are fundamentally, nasty and illiberal. But it ends up being that if you talk to some of the voters, there is a large discrepancy between rural and urban populations. There is large economic and social questions as well. But there's also a lot of things that do come from a communist past that have never really been sorted out or discussed in a constructive manner. And these are kind of like coming back as well. In the Visegrad countries, and I think that just to change a little bit in terms of fake news, I agree. I think that that's kind of not the point. A lot of it ends up being about perceptions rather than facts. There was an interesting poll from the spring that the International Republican Institute did in the Visegrad countries. And one of the questions was, do you believe your standard of living to be closer to Russia or to Western Europe? And in all of the countries, to varying degrees, the majority actually said that their standards of living were closer to Russia, which is patently false. But you could give any number of facts to counter that, and the answer will still be, but I have to wait 6 months for an operation, right? Or take the train from Vienna to Bratislava, and you will see the difference between East and West. There's a perception of being a second-class citizen within the European Union, which I think also ends up driving these anti-EU narratives. And it doesn't matter how many facts, figures you'll throw at them, because there's still a degree of, well, again, opinion and perception that's hard to put out. Again, the challenge is, what do you do about it, right? The challenge is what domestically identify as being the painful points, and ultimately, what's the political response to it?
Thank you, Joanna. Anton, both of them, Milena and Joanna, have in a certain way, in different ways, contested what you have said, or at least contested the importance of the research you're doing. So I'll just give you the floor, perhaps. That's my understanding, just to react to it.
No, I didn't feel that. I think the question was about the fake news, and I would completely agree with Joanna and the Hungarian colleague. Probably it's the same, Petr Kreko. Yeah. So I also believe that actually Russia is very uncreative in creating problems. It's very good at exploiting them and manipulating them. And of course, many of the, especially if you were looking at the US elections and what Russia did there, it just took all the weak spots of the American society and tried to exaggerate them and make them worse. But these are weak spots of the American society and not of Russia of doing. But at the same time, so that would be, exploiting weak spots would be the major strategy. But then also fake news is something different. It's when they invent things. And one of my favorite examples that is coming from the late Cold War, when the Soviet intelligence created a fake news story, essentially a lie, that AIDS was invented by the CIA. And that was huge. That was really huge. And even the Americans, and Gorbachev was already at the head of the Soviet state. The Americans asked Gorbachev to stop that rumors because it really had an impact on how America was perceived in other countries. So, and that was not using any weak spot. There is no weak spot. It's just a conspiracy theory. Why it was widespread in the world, not in the US, but in other parts of the world. Why it was why it became a scandal. That's another question, but that was not a weak spot that the Soviet Union exploited. So there are these fake news, and I gave you examples about, for example, the Hungarian tanks being delivered to Ukraine. This is not a weak spot. I mean, there was nothing to be exploited. That was a story that was created to discredit maybe Hungary or NATO, that they were trying to arm Ukraine without any resolution from the United Nations or whatever, or covertly arm Ukraine to undermine the so-called peace process in eastern Ukraine. So fake news, they do have impact, and we can see that because they create these scandals, and and I would even say that maybe it's also it could be interpreted as a sort of a reflexive control operation, where you create a story just for the sake for the other side to confront it, but then make it even bigger than it was in the very beginning. There's this from the active measures, the Soviet active measures, the reflexive control operation was quite a common tool to fight the information war with the West.
So we are coming to the question from what's going on to the question what to do about it. And the main topic is if we react in an illiberal way by defending against fake news or against Russian influence, aren't we in the danger to react just in the same way, to do just the same thing as Russia has done with these invented foreign agents? Because the Russian story runs, as Anton has said, but the other way around. Until '89, the West had no sticks in the game of information in the Soviet Union. Then the situation turned around, and what did they do to find local actors? They bought human rights groups and financed them. When the Russian state reacted, they gave them the ability to have their servers in the West. They bought the Maidan revolution. So it's just a mirror of the story. But there has to be a difference. And the difference between these two stories is about a liberal worldview and propaganda on the one hand, and on the way we react to it. It can't be the same by just protecting by security measures. There must be a difference. And what's the way we have to react? Yes?
I think the difference is integrity to a large extent. So you can't have narrative counter-narrative. It doesn't work that way. Debunking a fake story is relatively, I would say, easy because you check the facts and that's it. If you're providing a counter-narrative, then it has to be based on something. I think that the main difference is that the Russian approach lacks integrity, right? I mean, it's kind of, there's no holds barred in terms of what it goes, whereas the Western systems, by definition, block that because there's more controls on it, right? You know, it's different if you're talking about something like PSYOPs, but we're not talking about that, right? Like that belongs into a completely different sphere of influence. If you're talking about the reactions from Western media, then it's inherent in the system to have integrity, I think, right? There is, the way that media should be built is that there's fact-checking built into it, either through the reporters, the journalists, and the editorial staff. So, you know, there's also a transparency in everything that Western institutions do. Again, unless you want to start talking about black ops or whatever, but we're not talking about that. If you're talking about the way that Western institutions like mine work, our records are open. We're accountable to the public, absolutely. So I don't think you can say that on the other side.
Subscribing completely to what Joanna said, as a sociologist, I would like to add a detail. Because societies are not simple aggregate of reading creatures. So integrity in media are do not easily touch people. We have to have sophisticated or at least differentiated view about our societies. And the feeling of second-hand people, second-hand persons, is not only a matter of East and West. You can see how the Trump voters in the US, in the Midwest, don't they have the same feeling as well? So it's a matter of giving certain self-confidence of people. And I would like to add something very important to my mind. This feeling of second-handedness stems out of another feeling of injustice. In order to accept the inequality in a society, on global scale, on regional scale, on local scale, never mind, one has to have the feeling that those on the top are the best victims of the differentiating principles of society. If it is meritocracy, those on top should look like the best victims of meritocracy. I mean, risk-taking, not sleeping, and so on. And it doesn't look like that anymore, not only in our Eastern countries. So I think some rehabilitation of the differentiating principle is badly needed.
Okay, thank you. We are already running short in time, so I would like to open the floor to questions from you. Dimitar, please introduce yourself.
I'll bring it to Mike. Sorry. There you go.
Thank you very much. We are colleagues with Milena, and I'm coming from Critic and Humanism Journal and from Human and Social Study Foundation, and I would like to add two observations that could be useful for our conversation from our study. When Volker asked which are the local actors that engage in Russian or pro-Russian propaganda on their own, not because they are directly paid by Russia, we could explain the logics of such engagement. Indeed, in Bulgaria, but not only in Bulgaria, there are local businesses that leaks of the state and that have their own interest to stay in the green zone without internal resistance from the civic society and without international resistance from the international institutions trying to control the fairness of the local scene. So when you use the vocabulary that blames the local civic activists as Sorosoids, as liberal fascists, as tolerants, these are words taken directly from the Russian propaganda, literally taken. You have a weapon to silence the local resistances from the NGO sector, from the human rights organizations, and so on. On the other hand, when you blame the international institutions, the EU institutions, or you have a weapon to silence the control from outside. This is the logics that explains why very local oligarchs or local businesses are taking the Russian propaganda as a weapon. And the other thing is that not only the far-right parties and people engage in the Russian propaganda. We see the same symptom on the left, on the far left. For example, in Bulgaria, the leftist side of the scene is more engaged in the pro-Russian propaganda. Why? Because there are two general messages of the Russian media, constantly repeated, that are useful or that easily can be accepted by the leftists. The first one is the critique of the neoliberal elites. This message is, of course, taken from the left critique of the neoliberalism. But this message is translated by Russian media into a geopolitical, geostrategic message. The neoliberal elites, they are in fact metonymized with US, with the Brussels, or with Soros, doesn't matter. And the second, more tricky point is that Russian propaganda prepares a strange mixture of the meanings of the people, the left and the right meanings of the people. You know that the classical left meaning of the people is the weak, the poor, the ruthless people. And the right meaning of the people is the authentic ethnos, or connected by earth and blood. But in the process of globalization, we have a not good coincidence of these two meanings, because this has social reasons. Because more often now the poorest people are people that are localized by the globalizations. The users of globalizations are localized, and they are not mobile, in the sense of Bauman, for example. That is why the Russian propaganda co-opts these two meanings of the left and the right meaning of the people, and again translates them into geopolitical terms. That is why the leftist people in many countries, not only in Bulgaria, I believe, easily catch this vocabulary. Thank you.
I just want to add something. That I think you must understand that Bulgaria is a very special case, and I'm actually surprised that there are any pro-Western forces in Bulgaria, because I think the entire mainstream is taken up by pro-Russian actors. So Bulgaria is a very special case.
I don't see Bulgaria is a special case. What Dimitar said can directly be applied to Germany. Perhaps not in the same dimension, but you have the far right, you have the far left, and you have even business groups who are linked to Russia that perhaps they do not copy fake news, or it's not this kind of propaganda, but it's what we call the Putin Versteher. So you have to understand the position of the other side. So it's just, they are changing the discourse, they're changing what is true, what has happened on Crimea. They're just copying the geopolitical view on the world. They are copying the view that there have to be great powers securing Europe with influence zones, and they have concrete business interests. And this is Germany and not Bulgaria. So it's perhaps a special case in the way it's extreme, but it's not completely different. What about Poland?
I think it's difficult because there is a far right in Poland, but it's always been quite marginal. I think that the bigger problem is how ultra-conservative narratives have entered into what used to be more of a center-right narrative. And I think that's the bigger problem, and that seems to also be a tendency in a number. I mean, because you still do have your fringe groups, and I know that they play really well in the media, but understanding that that is the minority, which doesn't mean that there's certain nationalistic narratives that don't play, but into a much broader audience. And there's a different set of reasons for that, not to justify it, but it's a little bit different. The far left in Poland, or how'd you say, any kind of social democratic or left-wing movement in Poland was always quite doomed by the post-communist past because the left-wing parties come out of the former communist party. You know, they definitely kind of crashed and burned in the last elections, and they haven't been able to pick up. I mean, if there was a more rational left alternative, then it would probably be well served. But in terms of more anarchistic narratives, if you want, that kind of fall on the far left rather than the far right, there you will also pick up, and it ends up being that the system doesn't serve the people and whatnot, and it's more along those lines, which it's always hard to untie the threads. What is a kind of a fellow traveler with the Russian narrative, and how much of it is just basically disenchantment with the system as it stands now? That helps. But I agree that I don't think that Bulgaria is an exceptional case. I think that you'll see shades of this in everywhere.
So we are close to the end of this panel, but I have one more question. Perhaps it's a question from me to the audience, because as the panel, okay, we can be. If there are questions, please show up. Daniel, this will be a question. Oh, okay. But
well, if I may, in that case. Simon Garnett, editor of Eurozine. I would like to pick up Milena to ask, this distinction between propaganda.
Michael?
Yeah, sorry. To pick up on your question of the distinction, your wish to use the term propaganda, and your dislike of the term disinformation. And I can understand that disinformation is far less kind of comprehensive, so it doesn't include this kind of systematic ideological element. We're talking here about units of information that may or may not have been placed in order to disinform, but that we don't want taking into account sort of their broader systematic context. On the other hand, propaganda, and this is why I find that there's possibly a kind of a contradiction in your use of propaganda, does imply a sort of univocal, i.e. unidirectional kind of line of communication. And as far as I understand it, what you're talking about is the way that kind of diffuse sort of discontent within liberal democratic systems is picking up on a variety of talking points and sort of forming these into a kind of a homegrown kind of diffuse anti-elitist critique. So can one have kind of homegrown propaganda? And is this not somehow a kind of the term somehow kind of also historically inherited? So just wonder if you could develop on that.
This was a question which expects its dissertation as an answer. Thanks, Simon. It's really important. My insistence on the word propaganda is for two reasons. Technically, it's more precise, and I'll be more detailed about this. More precise when we describe what is going on. But second, my second point is that the term propaganda is a term belonging to a critical vocabulary. Well, disinformation is sort of a vague word. We can be more critical if we call certain things greediness and not structural conditions for accumulation, the profits, and here and there. And do you understand? But this is not only this propagandist end that I have in mind while calling this propaganda. Propaganda is speech that aims to be effective. And not, your question presupposes that propaganda has to have certain positive worldview in the horizon or not, or am I wrong? No, you do not presuppose that. Yes, as to the, yes, it has, its source can be, so to say, can differ. Because this is a fluid mixture of critical discourses wrapped up by certain strategic research institutes that have their ends. But they create tools that circulate. The situation is different. It is not the Cold War situation of COCOM and so on. We have free market of circulating those figures. And those figures are easily accessible for different actors. So yes, some of them use it toward one end, others use it toward different end. And term propaganda gives us better chance to, how can I say, just to recognize the different sources. There was another very important point, the recipients. The recipients are being created as recipients in this process of addressing. How is this done? Oh, you are a we because you are victims. The strategy of victimization is very important for the effectiveness of propaganda. So yes, I agree with a certain point. What we see is not the aggressive propaganda, but all the time, as Jacques Ellul says, we first have this sociological, he calls it, slow propaganda that makes the soil ready for more aggressive pushes and drives. But this still is propaganda because it wraps pre-existent diffuse attitudes into hard stereotypes.
Any further questions?
Hello, my name is Ege Kulbok-Lötik and I'm a researcher of politics of culture. And it was very interesting, thank you. I'd like to say that the idea of propaganda is whatever the point it comes, or source it comes. The idea of propaganda is the control of thinking, and attitudes, of course, and shaping these attitudes. But this slow shaping of the speech, it is, of course, it perhaps the idea is the same. Just to add about what is the difference of disinformation and propaganda, and what is the aim and idea of this result of these speeches. I think that this power to legitimate the whole system is the need for that control, to legitimate these two different systems of liberal or or this Soviet or socialist or central democracy. So that was my point.
It can be used toward different ends. The first and very direct end was anti-migrant attitude to be clearly formulated, and the broader public to have the self-confidence that we are very nice persons while pushing migrants aside. The propaganda should not be confused with accepting certain worldview. Our socialist system is nice, their capitalist is bad, or vice versa. It is the readiness to act or accept actions. One another thing that came to my mind after hearing your comment, actually, and giving a shoulder to the definition. It does not try to convince. It's monotonous, repetitive, highly anonymous, working on our belief in facts, working on our rationalistic post-enlightenment belief that reality exists in the mode of facticity, fact by fact, sliced and diced. This is a sheer myth. And reinforcing this belief is, of course, creating a very dispersed public. We are not a public anymore. We are an aggregate of lonely individuals. This is what propaganda creates as well. So I think we can understand more if we use this term and not disinformation. Disinformation presupposes facts checking, but people believe that reality is fact. They do not check them. They take them in groups, by associations, in a very plastic manner, not in a rationalistic reading, checking. Yeah, this is what I can say.
Let me start by thanking you all for a fascinating and gripping session. I feel I have learned so much, and I thank you all. I want to challenge you on something. We're talking very much at this conference about the future, the impact of digital technology on so many aspects of our lives. I want to ask you your views, really, on quite the other end of things. I think it was it Tolstoy who said that a people who didn't know its history was doomed to repeat it. You look a bit impatient. I am moving on. I'm moving on. I invented a phrase which I was challenged about some years ago, that a people, not about knowing your history, a people without history is not redeemed from the passage of time. By that I meant that if we don't teach history, if a society, and I mean all levels of society, do not know and are not educated in their history, then they are likely to be victims of a repetition of that history, because whether you've got digital technology or not, and I think the word propaganda here is a very good one, propaganda hasn't changed. The purposes, the motives, the mechanics, the human aspects of propaganda may be delivered on a different technology, but the purpose and the motive has not changed. And just very briefly to conclude, I've noted recently in the UK, the teaching of history in good schools, let alone poorer schools, is really anecdotal and self-serving, and I fear that we are losing our history, and we should be the poorer in many ways.
So my impatience is only because I have a 15-year-old daughter, and I'm a historian by training and was married to a history teacher. So I agree with you full out, and it's a problem overall, I would say. I mean, so I'm not even going to comment about her going to school in the US where the history program is terrible, but even in all countries, I think that, I mean, and it kind of goes back to the last session in terms of what the emphasis on teaching humanities in general is, right? So teaching history and history narratives is one part of it. teaching literature, teaching overall humanities to get kind of a better root in terms of where you come from and how to judge things. I absolutely agree with you, I say. I think that it's a bigger challenge because here you start coming into national education programs and what the point of education is. Is it to create people who can have jobs, or is it can people who think, and how that's divided? But I would say that that's a completely, it's a much broader discussion, but yes, that's my impatience because I have to deal with a teenager.
So the focus of the panel has very much shifted from the question what is the way propaganda is spread to the question what is propaganda, from the question the focus on foreign influence to the focus on resilience of societies, to how to close weak spots by teaching history and so on. Nevertheless, I think it's a closing question, not a closing answer. We should continue to ask ourselves what part of the countermeasures against conspiracy, against propaganda, should be thinking about technologies, what is the share of new technologies which are able to spread propaganda more quickly, and what can we do about this? This should be part of the answer. Even if I agree that the main point is we should think about how to teach history, how to teach liberal values, autonomy of the subject.
Brief reaction to Judy's comment and question and to Volker's final comments. Teaching history is the question of the we. Who's the we of this history? So I think this is a good shift in our discussion.